The Crystal Bowl by Bruce Zabriskie. Brandon had just picked up his guitar when he heard a loud thumping at the front door. Perfect timing, he thought to himself irritably before carefully propping his guitar up against a nearby chair. Very begrudgingly, he hauled himself up from a large floor cushion and then quickly rumbled his way down the stairwell. Under more normal circumstances, he would probably have ignored the knock altogether, as 9 times out of 10 it was just a salesman trying to extract his credit card number, or failing that, someone from a local church looking to recruit him to their flock. There was something about the urgent sound of the knocking, however, that told him he had to answer the door immediately, and his instincts said that they were not about to go away anytime soon. He cautiously peered through the frosted glass paneling and was able to make out the vague shape of a person leaning in towards him. Upon closer inspection, he was rather startled to see the face of someone staring directly back at him. Somewhat improbably, they had somehow managed to catch his eye despite the refracting glass. The game was up, and he resigned himself to the fact he would have to answer the door, regardless of whether he wanted to or not. With a mild sense of trepidation, Brandon swung the door open wide. He had thought to catch the man off guard, but was instead greeted with the visage of a well-dressed, suited individual standing tall and erect. The man held a hand out in front of him as if expecting a warm handshake in return. Ignoring the extended limb, Brandon drifted his gaze upwards until he met the face of this most unwelcome and unexpected visitor. The man had sharp green eyes, a thin chiseled face with a long pointed nose, and a well-practiced prefabricated smile. Brandon noted that he also carried a dark, heavy-looking suitcase at his side. Despite the man's overtly friendly demeanor, Brandon felt a stark, impenetrable coldness emanating back at him.
"Can I help you?"
Brandon asked inquisitively, with what he hoped was just the right dose of annoyance. Whatever this guy was selling, it was important that he get the message forthwith, that he was wasting his time and would be leaving empty-handed.
"Well, that rather depends. You are Brandon Forsyth, are you not?"
It wasn't a real question. There was just something in his tone and demeanor that said he knew very well who he was speaking to, and this preamble was little more than some sort of disconcerting pantomime.
"The last time I checked, yes. So let me ask you again. Can I help you?"
The suited man smiled enthusiastically.
"Well, as it turns out, Mr. Forsyth, I do believe you can help me by allowing me to help you. Now, as pretentiously patronizing as that may sound, it is nevertheless the God's honest truth."
Here it comes, Brandon thought to himself wearily. A Jehovah's Witness. Now, why had he not picked up on that blazingly obvious fact the moment he had opened the door? The man's face took on a comedically knowing expression.
But I know exactly what you are thinking, Mr. Forsyth, and you couldn't be more wrong. In point of fact, I am here simply to deliver you a prize. Whether you realize it or not, you have just beaten some incredible odds. No, I am very happy to inform you that you have won a gift of singularly unique historical significance.
So a scammer, then, Brandon thought to himself wearily. I should probably just close the door on this douchebag's face without further hesitation. Then again, it might be fun to mess with him a little and waste some of his time.
"Historical significance, you say?"
Brandon said brightly, feigning sudden interest.
"Well, I must confess you have piqued my curiosity. Perhaps you can tell me a little bit more about this mysterious prize that I have allegedly won."
I would love nothing more than the opportunity to do exactly that. But perhaps we might be more comfortable discussing this inside your residence, yes?
The tall man stole a suggestive glance towards the stairwell.
"I'm quite comfortable exactly where I am, but I certainly appreciate your concern,"
Brandon retorted wryly.
"Now then, it occurs to me you have not yet told me your name, or perhaps more importantly, who you work for."
The suited man looked aghast.
"Well, how very rude of me. My sincerest apologies, Mr. Forsyth. My name is Ilian F. Arafel. I represent a global research company called Genetically Gifted, We specialize in the investigation and documentation of family tree dynasties for select clientele. Perhaps you have heard of a company called 23andMe. I suppose you could say we work in a similar field, but needless to say, we treat customer confidentiality a good deal more seriously than those incompetent clowns.
The well-dressed man again extended his hand in an almost desperate display of overt congeniality. Oh, this is going to be good, Brandon thought to himself mischievously. He took Ilian's hand with his best attempt at feigned enthusiasm.
You know what? Perhaps we would be more comfortable inside after all. Please, come on in, Mr. Arafel.
Ilian stepped through the doorway eagerly, an almost comical look of surprise on his face.
I hope you don't mind me saying so, but I rather do like your home, Mr. Forsyth. Very good feng shui.
The toll man said smoothly as they made their way up the stairwell. Is this guy even for real? Brandon thought to himself with a considerable amount of bemused contempt.
Oh, you play the guitar?
Ilian asked approvingly, nodding towards the musical instrument.
Might I ask what type of music you like to play?
Brandon hesitated awkwardly. This was not a question he found particularly comfortable answering.
The bad type, I'm afraid to say. Seriously, though, I really only play for my own pleasure, and would never dream of subjecting others to my appalling lack of skill.
Nonsense. I'm sure you are much better than you give yourself credit for. But please, Mr. Forsyth, you needn't be alarmed. I'm not about to ask you to play for me. I appreciate music can be a very personal thing.
Brandon smiled uncomfortably and earnestly sought to change the subject.
Can I offer you some tea or coffee, Mr. Arafel?
Ilian did not appear to hear the question.
I'm a sucker for classical myself, but rather suspect I am part of a dying breed. Still, we didn't come up here to discuss music now, did we?
Ilian lifted up the suitcase surreptitiously in front of him and then tapped the side of it suggestively, as if to emphasize the importance of its contents.
May I?
He asked politely while gesturing towards the dining room table.
Please be my guest.
Brandon replied agreeably, genuinely now curious as to what the suitcase actually contained. With an ingratiating smile, Ilian lay his case down flat on the nearby hardwood table. He proceeded to deftly spin the combination lock before unclasping two catches on either side of the suitcase, each locking mechanism unlatched with a satisfying click. Ilian theatrically placed his hands either side of the lid, paused briefly, then lifted his gaze up ominously.
Before I let you see this, perhaps it might be prudent if I provide you with a little more background about the purpose and meaning of your prize. Now I know you will be very eager to see what you have won, but trust me, context is everything, and it will mean so much more when you are able to fully appreciate its true significance and value.
Aha, now here comes the sales pitch, Brandon thought to himself smugly.
Please contextualize to your heart's content, Mr. Arafel.
Ilian smiled broadly, and then to Brandon's considerable annoyance, relatched the suitcase.
Well, very good then. Let me start by asking you this simple question. How much do you actually know about your family tree, on its paternal side, for example?
Brandon hesitated briefly before offering a succinct reply.
Not much, actually. I only met my natural father a handful of times before he shed his mortal coil.
Oh, how sad.
Ilian said dismissively before quickly continuing to speak.
Well, in any event, I think you may be quite surprised to learn your grandfather came to this country from China as a refugee of war, originally from what was then known as the Canton province.
Brandon's eyes narrowed. This conversation was taking an unexpected turn. If Ilian really was a scammer, then this was seemingly a very targeted and elaborate hoax.
And on your maternal side, we have extensive documentation of your Polish ancestry. Did you know one of your forebears was an inventor of minor fame and celebrity?
Brandon snorted dismissively.
Yes, actually. As a matter of fact, I did. However, I fail to see how your disturbingly invasive knowledge of my ancestry helps to bring context to this so-called gift. What exactly is in it for you, Mr. Arafel? Now, explaining something like that might help me understand why you are really here.
Ilian spread his hands wide, a shit-eating grin blossoming across his face.
You are, of course, absolutely right, Mr. Forsyth. The point of this mildly overbearing little history lesson was to convey the rather crucial fact that you are not a product of random chance, but a direct and unambiguous result of your own ancestry.
Where on God's green earth is he going with this? Brandon thought to himself incredulously.
So, before I present you with your prize, it is of crucial importance, you understand. It is little more than a totem of the gift that has always lived inside you.
Brandon stiffened reflexively. This situation was quickly starting to get out of hand, and he needed to regain control immediately.
All right, Mr. Arafel, enough is enough. I think you either need to show me this totem of yours right now, or you need to leave immediately.
Ilian held up his hands in a placating gesture.
As you wish, Mr. Forsyth. I must say I'm mildly disappointed with your apparent lack of gratitude, but in any event, whether you like it or not, all is about to become crystal clear. Speaking of which, just a minor correction. It is not my totem, it is yours. So rest assured, it will be my singular purpose, pleasure, and honor to make absolutely certain you get what is coming to you.
The strange man unlatched the suitcase and slowly opened the lid. He slipped his hands into the interior of the case and then carefully brought out an object that appeared to be covered in layers of protective wrapping. Placing the suitcase to the floor, he gently started to peel away the fine sheets of tissue one piece at a time, until at last there was nothing but a soft felt cloth covering a nondescript circular object. As he gently removed the cloth, it became quickly apparent that what they were looking at was a crystal bowl of truly astounding complexity and workmanship.
Now then, Mr. Forsyth, as remarkable as this crystal bowl undoubtedly is, in truth it is little more than the equivalent of a gross two-dimensional shadow of the very thing that now beholds it.
Ilian proceeded to surreptitiously remove a candle from within the bowl's mouth, and then lovingly polished its flawless glass interior with the cloth that had been wrapped all around it.
This bowl was created on the same day that you opened your eyes for the very first time, and it has been patiently waiting for you ever since. Now then, the time has finally arrived for you to claim what fate has always intended for you to receive.
Ilian held the charcoal black candle out in front of him for Brandon to see.
I know it may not look like much, but don't be fooled. This candle is here to fuel the sacred inner light that burns within you, for we would surely all live in perpetual darkness without it. With your permission, then, I would like to invite you to ignite its flame so we can behold the naked beauty of this truly remarkable, one-of-a-kind artifact.
Ilian rummaged within one of his pockets and pulled out a small candle holder which was in the shape of a half-moon waxing. He fitted it to the candle, then placed it carefully beside the bowl. It was only then that Brandon noticed the windows were almost pitch black, and he realized it must have been close to midnight. This made absolutely no sense at all, as it had been scarcely late morning when this strange man had first knocked at his door. How had he managed to squander so much time? This deeply perplexing thought only served to fill him with a desperate sense of panic, as if he had just dropped something of immense value over the side of a tall building, then narrowly failed in his attempt to grab back hold of it. It's all too late now, he thought to himself despairingly.
But I know exactly how you feel, Mr. Forsyth.
Ilian muttered sympathetically.
It is the lament of oh so many, those long past, and no doubt those still to come. But this gift is your manifest destiny. The burning light of your candle's flame patiently awaits you, Mr. Forsyth.
The mysterious man, now shrouded in shadow, presented Brandon with a small, ornately crafted lighter. Embossed upon its surface were the letters IFA, and he found himself idly wondering what the letter F actually stood for. Ilian's eyes shone brightly from within the shadows that now hid his face, as he presented an open palm in the direction of the candle. No choice anymore, Brandon thought to himself miserably, as he sparked the lighter into life and held its dancing flame over the wick of the candle.
Such poetry in motion,
Ilian proclaimed rapturously.
Just look at the way the shadows play on the walls. A thing of such exquisite beauty, is it not?
The mysterious man was absolutely right, Brandon thought to himself, with a sense of genuine wonderment. The mesmerizing patterns of shadow and light spoke of unfathomable complexity, held within the intricate walls of the crystal bowl. Who could have crafted such a beautiful thing? Brandon thought to himself, as he felt his consciousness being raised to a whole new level of awareness. Ilian lightly placed an encouraging hand onto Brandon's shoulder.
Now then, Mr. Forsyth, if you look very carefully, you will even be able to see yourself reflected back from within the eyes of the crystal bowl.
Brandon leaned in curiously and peered closely at the intricate folds of reflective glass. After a brief moment, he was able to see multiple identical images laid out in the pattern of a hexagonal grid staring back at him. Ilian whispered encouragingly into Brandon's ear.
Just concentrate on the center image and try your best to ignore all the others.
Feeling almost hypnotized, he did exactly as he was told. Sure enough, the peripheral images started to drift and fade beyond the horizon of his visual field until only a single image of himself and Ilian still remained.
Gotcha.
The skeletal man exclaimed victoriously as he quickly made to pick up the crystal bowl. Brandon instantly became disorientated, almost as if his eyes had been disembodied from his own head. Ilian excitedly lifted the bowl up to his face.
Can you see me, Mr. Forsyth?
Brandon could see a pair of sharp green eyes staring back at him through the multifaceted lens of the intricately folded crystal glass. Without waiting for a response, Ilian continued to speak.
Now I willingly concede it is entirely possible, perhaps even inevitable, you may come to think of me as some kind of demonic spirit, a manifestation of pure evil, here only to extract a twisted kind of pleasure from your own abject suffering. But I assure you, Mr. Forsyth, nothing could be further from the truth. I am the wind in the trees, the rain in the clouds, and the darkness of night through which the stars shine ever so brightly.
Ilian smiled sardonically as a perfect set of razor-sharp teeth glittered brightly in the candlelight.
For the love of God, what have you done to me?
Brandon barely managed to gasp with a paralyzing sense of terror.
Funny that you should ask. As luck would have it, I am in fact nothing more than God's humble paintbrush.
Ilian sounded deeply apologetic.
Very sadly, however, it's been my own personal experience that even God makes mistakes from time to time. Besides, I am reliably informed it is through your imperfections true beauty is to be found. Or not, as the case may be. But I guess we'll just have to wait and see, won't we?
Ilian began to playfully sway the bowl from side to side. Brandon's head felt dizzyingly light, and he unsteadily dropped to his knees while placing his hands to the floor to try and stabilize himself.
I won't lie to you, Mr. Forsyth. I suspect this is going to be a very rough ride. That said, I've seen people deal with far worse, and they didn't just survive, they thrived. So a little bit of free advice on the house. Try not to feel too sorry for yourself. That's almost a guaranteed recipe for disaster.
The tall man carefully placed the bowl back onto the table, then leaned his face in close towards it.
I'll leave you now to get better acquainted with your rather unique new circumstances. But before I go, a quick word about the candle. Rest assured that it is designed to burn for a lifetime, nor will it ever go out before fate itself demands it, unless, of course, you decide to blow it out yourself. Your destiny, as always, is entirely within your own hands.
Ilian straightened himself up primly as he drew his face away from the crystal bowl.
So with all that said, if by chance you should decide to take such drastic action, I will return one last time to collect the bowl, and you will never have to see me again. No doubt you will think that a very good thing. But be warned, Mr. Forsyth. It also means that you will be condemned to live in a shroud of perpetual darkness for the rest of your miserable life. Needless to say, I urge you to be brave and avoid making any rash decisions. Now I suggest you get yourself some much-needed rest. Trust me, I think you're going to need it.
The strange man started to leave but paused at the door to the stairwell, then cast a brief glance over his shoulder.
Oh, how unfortunate. Your lights don't seem to be working. It does appear that you may have suffered a power cut. Do try to be extra careful when moving around now, won't you? I can scarcely imagine how horrible it would be were you to drop and break that crystal bowl of yours.
Ilian quickly disappeared from view. After a few short moments, Brandon heard the front door slam shut. Suddenly feeling very alone, he began to pan his eyes slowly around the room. Apparently, he now had the ability to travel his gaze a full 360 degrees as he traversed the circumference of the bowl. The acuity it offered was simply astonishing, even in the dim light provided by the small candle. He could not, however, actually see his own physical body, as he was still lying prone upon the ground. He cautiously pressed himself up onto his hands and knees, then placed a foot to the floor before reaching one hand out searchingly to find the base of the table. Upon grasping something solid to balance himself against, he carefully levered himself up onto his feet, as his head, torso, and arms now became visible to his own disembodied eyes. Viewing himself in the third person was disorientating in the extreme, so he spent a great deal of time simply moving his arms around, turning his head side to side, and experimentally balancing on one foot. After a while, he started to regain a sense of spatial awareness, at least sufficiently enough that he did not feel like he would fall flat on his face were he to risk taking a step. He carefully repositioned himself to be closer to the bowl, and then lowered his face such that he was now level with its gaze. It was only then that his worst fears were realized as he stared into the dark pits that once contained the windows to his soul. Fighting down an overwhelming sense of panic, Brandon managed to gather himself sufficiently to plan his next steps. He proceeded to grasp hold of the bowl and then carefully placed it onto the crown of his head while holding it safely in place with one hand. He nervously lifted the candle and held it out in front of him before slowly making his way down the stairwell and into his bedroom. In contemplating the truly bizarre situation he now found himself in, Brandon concluded this simply could not be real. Very clearly then, it was nothing but a fantastically horrific dream. All he had to do was get himself to bed so he could wake up in the morning and hopefully remember nothing at all about this terrible nightmare unfolding. He briefly considered blowing the candle out, but quickly changed his mind. He distinctly remembered talking with someone a very long time ago about the possibility that if you died in your dream, you died in real life as well. A patently absurd notion, of course, but when the dream felt this real, there was a pervading sense of consequence he simply could not manage to shake. Placing the bowl and candle carefully to his bedside table, Brandon tried to turn on the night lamp and with no great surprise discovered it did not work. With a mild sense of frustration, he climbed into bed and closed the pits of his sightless eyes, hoping that his dreams within a dream would take him somewhere infinitely better than this. He tried to visualize squeezing his eyes shut from within the walls of the crystal bowl, but the flicker of the candle still brightly lit up his vision. Brandon sat himself up irritably and placed the bowl underneath the sheets of his bed, before laying back down heavily to sleep. Darkness quickly followed, but the dreams that invaded his mind were scarcely better than the one he had just endured before sliding under the blankets. When morning finally came, there was no sunlight to greet him. Worse still, to Brandon's utter dismay, his eyes remained firmly fixed to the walls of the crystal bowl. Well, perhaps, he thought to himself desperately, this was actually the dream world, and his bed was the one true reality, despite the monsters that haunted it. After all, as bad as his dreams had been, at least they still represented a fragile kind of hope, if only in the form of the almost limitless potential of his own imagination. The world he inhabited right now, on the other hand, as inconceivably bizarre as it seemingly had become, still had the all-too-familiar feeling of being hopelessly outside of his subliminal control. Very regretfully then, Brandon thought to himself miserably, that fact alone told the lie of his own wishful thinking. Finally managing to gather his wits, he swung his legs over the side of the bed and held the face of his smartphone to the eyes of the crystal bowl. The time read 9:05 a.m., and yet without the aid of the candle, he would have been left in complete and utter darkness.
Hey Google, what's the forecast for today?
Brandon asked with a minor flash of inspiration. Today's forecast is for perpetual darkness and rain. What the actual fuck? Brandon silently mouthed to himself. Yet somehow, this forecast was nothing less than what he had fully expected. Another very worrying thought then bulldogged its way into his consciousness.
Hey Google, what's my battery level?
Your battery level is 13%. Oh shit, Brandon thought to himself with a mild sense of panic. Almost involuntarily, his thoughts drifted to Alana. He brought up her history of text messages, which, if nothing else, were a reassuring reminder of the promise of love. After all, despite his insecurities, the proof was right there in front of him. He could trust in her, and he needed to let her know what was happening.
Something unbelievably scary has happened to my eyes, and I think maybe I need your help. Can you please come and see me as soon as you get the chance? Love, Brandon.
Now shrouded by a sinister darkness, broken only by the flicker of the candle's flame, Brandon peered hopefully at his phone, as if expecting an almost instant reply. After a minute or two of deafening silence, he reluctantly pressed the power button and shut the phone off. Apparently, he had no way to charge his phone anymore, and preserving its power was of paramount importance. He told himself to check it again for a response in an hour or two, feeling certain that she would surely have replied by then. Taking careful hold of the crystal bowl, he slowly made his way back upstairs, and was startled to find that Ilian was already there.
Ah, Mr. Forsyth, I trust you slept well, yes?
Brandon glared resentfully at the cruel-looking man.
No, not even remotely. Can you please, for the love of God, tell me what on earth is going on here? I mean, this is a dream, right? You simply can't be real. None of this can possibly be real. Which does, of course, beg the question, when am I going to be allowed to wake back up?
Ilian's expression took on a strange mix of both pity and consternation. He strode briskly over to where Brandon was standing and placed a comforting hand upon one of his shoulders.
A religious man, then, are you, Mr. Forsyth?
Brandon looked startled by the question.
What on earth would make you think that? Not that it's any of your business, but I actually regard myself as a rationally minded agnostic, or as I have often described myself in the past to others, a spiritual agnostic.
Ilian's reply had a distinctly patronizing tone.
Spiritual, you say? Well, how very poetic. So what you are telling me then is that you are not above indulging in the fine art of virtue signaling in order to appease some of your less rationally minded peers.
Brandon stiffened defensively.
Like I said, I'm agnostic. I neither believe nor disbelieve. I've always been at peace with admitting some things are by their very nature unknowable.
Ilian smiled mockingly.
Well, how very humble of you, Mr. Forsyth. After all, straddling the boundary line between logos and mythos while maintaining one's intellectual integrity must surely be quite the juggling act. My point, however, remains firmly intact.
Brandon frostily removed Ilian's hand from his shoulder.
If you have made any point at all, Mr. Arafel, then it is one so trivial as to be scarcely worth mentioning. To say nothing of the fact you have yet to actually answer my question, which means, of course, that I have not answered my own question, because very clearly you are just a figment of my imagination, and nothing more than a part of this torturous dream I seem to be hopelessly trapped within.
Seemingly unperturbed, Ilian smoothly placed his hand back to Brandon's shoulder.
Now, Mr. Forsyth, I'm not here to judge you. All I'm doing is making a simple observation. It certainly was not my intention to upset you by delivering one too many truth bombs than you are apparently fitted to handle.
Brandon sighed heavily.
And I say yet again, Mr. Arafel, you didn't make that observation. In point of fact, I did. You are nothing more than a grotesque avatar of my subliminal consciousness, spouting my own insecurities back to me.
The willowy man snorted contemptuously.
Well, in any event, it does rather seem to me, or should I say your subliminal avatar, that when we get right down into the weeds, you are no different from anyone else.
Ilian proceeded to pat Brandon's shoulder in an infuriatingly patronizing fashion.
If you don't mind me saying so, Mr. Forsyth, it will be very interesting indeed to see how your belief system evolves as you travel your way through this so-called dream of yours. Speaking of which...
The shadowy man's piercing green eyes now stared fiercely into the crystal bowl, and then, with breathtaking speed, he snatched it from Brandon's grasp before leaping rapidly away from him.
I grow oh so tired, Mr. Forsyth, of all this needless chit-chat. It's time to find out what you are really made of.
Ilian started to casually bounce the bowl up and down on one hand, as if taking measure of its weight. Brandon involuntarily dropped down onto his hands and knees. However, the ghostly man seemed scarcely to even notice.
You know I must have delivered countless such crystal bowls as this over the last several millennia, and without a word of a lie, Mr. Forsyth, in all that time, no two bowls have ever been exactly alike. Nonetheless, if I've managed to learn anything at all over my many years of bitter experience, surely one of the most important attributes has to be balance. I mean to say, without that, your life would be spent with you forever getting yourself back up onto your feet, just so you can fall back down again.
Ilian let out a tragic sigh.
I think you would be utterly dismayed to learn just how many people go from the cradle to the grave, blaming everyone but themselves for every mishap they suffer, when in the end they only had themselves to blame.
Ilian looked down at Brandon with a look of abject pity, then proceeded to kick him hard into the solar plexus.
Get back up onto your feet, Mr. Forsyth. What are you, a dog? Playtime is now officially over, and I very much assure you, you are in the real world now.
Brandon remained on his hands and knees as he struggled to regain his breath.
Oh, come now, Mr. Forsyth. Don't make me kick you again.
Needing no further encouragement, Brandon placed a foot to the floor and then very unsteadily made his way back up onto his feet.
Much better. Now then, let's get started, shall we? By the way, you might want to widen your stance just a little.
Ilian placed the bowl onto one of his fingertips and with a wicked smile began to deftly spin it with his opposing hand. The room turned into a blur, and Brandon instinctively grasped the side of the nearby table in a desperate attempt to keep his feet.
That's cheating, Mr. Forsyth.
The skeletal man declared disapprovingly. However, his eyes remained firmly locked onto the crystal bowl. With the seasoned skill of a professional acrobat, Ilian began to alternately toss the bowl from one fingertip to the other, while somehow still managing to prevent it from falling. In a melodramatic final flourish, he tossed the bowl high up into the air, performed a 360-degree pirouette, and then caught it with both hands just fractions of a second before it hit the floor. Brandon once again found himself on all fours, this time dry-reaching uncontrollably. When the convulsions at last started to subside, his vision began to stabilize and the tall man's sharp green eyes came back into violent focus.
Just as I fully suspected, Mr. Forsyth, this crystal bowl is of the finest workmanship. In fact, it might be one of the most finely balanced bowls I have ever had the pleasure of screwing around with. Even so, just to be absolutely certain, I will need to give it a thorough visual examination.
Ilian fished out a small magnifying glass from a jacket pocket and brought it up to one of his eyes. He then began to peer into the crystal bowl inquisitively from one end to the other. While scanning the base of the bowl, he suddenly paused and whispered the words, "Don't move a muscle." He remained perfectly still for what seemed like a small eternity. At long last, placing the magnifying glass back into his pocket, Ilian took the bowl in both hands and peered solemnly into the intricate crystal lattice.
I'm afraid I must be the bearer of some most unwelcome tidings. While I cannot deny the masterful workmanship of this magnificent crystal bowl, it does nevertheless seem that on balance, it comes with a rather significant flaw. Now you might want to sit yourself down for this, Mr. Forsyth, before I break the news.
Immediately realizing his gaffe, the tall man then quickly added,
Oh, how silly of me. I see that you are, of course, already fully seated. Well, to business, then.
Ilian looked like he was just about to start speaking, but then began to pace randomly around the room.
Well, in a nutshell, Mr. Forsyth, your crystal bowl was simply not made to last. Now, of course, there are things you could have done had you actually known about it, to protect yourself against this most unfortunate flaw. But I'm very sorry to say that time has long since passed you by. Still, there remains an admittedly infinitesimal quantum of hope, so perhaps not all is yet lost.
Ilian continued to pace up and down the room furiously while muttering to himself under his breath. He threw a fleeting glance towards Brandon and then did an incredulous double take. A frighteningly accusatory expression dawned inexorably across his face.
Oh no, Mr. Forsyth. You actually knew all along, didn't you? Or should I say, you knew, but chose not to believe.
The tall man shook his head regretfully, as if one of his favorite students had just badly let him down.
Whatever are we going to do with you, Mr. Forsyth? I mean to say, it would appear you are not such a rationally minded agnostic after all. At least not when it becomes too inconvenient for you anyway. Then again, it's catastrophic failures like this that can make one a true believer. Trust me, it wouldn't be the first time, and no doubt it won't be the last either.
Ilian now stared appraisingly at the prone figure lying helplessly on the floor.
Oh, chin up, Mr. Forsyth. After all, they do say that a big helping of humble pie is good for the soul. Metaphorically speaking, of course. No, but seriously, beating yourself up is hardly going to make this situation any better. Now, is it?
The darkly shrouded man smiled grimly, and his razor-sharp teeth glinted menacingly in the candlelight. He casually made to lean against the hardwood table, but apparently misjudged the position of his elbow, which slipped away from the polished wooden edge. The bowl, which was precariously balanced on one hand, tottered away from the tips of his fingers and quickly plummeted towards the floor. Landing heavily on its side with a startlingly loud thunk, it then began to roll in a circular motion. The bowl slowly spiraled inwards until finally oscillating in place like a very large coin. Eventually, it settled down onto its base, and it felt almost as if time itself ceased to exist.
Well, shit on me.
Ilian proclaimed incredulously, his eyes growing wide with mock surprise.
I think there must be something wrong with your table, Mr. Forsyth, as I have never done anything remotely like that ever before. Luckily for you, however, it appears that your crystal bowl remains intact, despite its apparent design flaw.
No sooner had Ilian finished speaking when the crystal bowl split apart into 3 separate pieces. After a brief moment of stunned silence, the tall man stared down guiltily at the shattered bowl.
Well, very clearly, I need to learn when to keep my big mouth shut. But don't you go worrying yourself, Mr. Forsyth. I have just the thing to sort this mess out.
Ilian strode purposefully over to his suitcase and opened it up onto the hardwood table. After feverishly rummaging through its contents, he lifted his gaze up triumphantly.
Found it.
Ilian briskly made his way over to the crystal bowl before briefly tilting his head to one side, as if releasing a small crick from his neck. He then knelt down smoothly beside the 3 broken shards and picked up one of the glass fragments, holding a small white tube directly in front of it.
Do you see this, Mr. Forsyth? Well, I certainly hope so, because it is no less than your key to salvation.
Brandon struggled mightily to make any sense of the image in front of him. The whole world looked askew, almost like a Penrose staircase. Nonetheless, he just barely managed to make out the words, "One drop holds a ton."
That's right, Mr. Forsyth. This is only the very best superglue money can buy.
Ilian casually tossed the small tube onto the floor next to the broken crystal bowl.
Now, for heaven's sake, pull yourself back together, and I'll check in on you again in the morning.
Brandon heard the front door slam shut just as he was getting onto his hands and knees. Very frighteningly, he could now see virtually nothing. Perhaps mercifully, however, he still had a reasonable sense of where the crystal bowl was located. Crawling haphazardly across the floor, Brandon desperately made his way towards the bowl until his hand suddenly pressed into something sharp. He felt a painful burning sensation race across the palm of his hand. Crying out in startled shock, he pulled his hand quickly away from the glass fragment and then placed it instinctively to his mouth. It felt slick with wetness and tasted slightly bitter. He could feel his blood dripping off his skin as it formed a small puddle on the floor. Doing his level best not to panic, he visualized the location of the cabinet where he kept all his kitchen towels. Perhaps, rather fortuitously, it was located low to the ground, so he would not need to stand up in order to access it. Being extremely careful to avoid any more glass fragments, he chose to crawl in a wide arc until encountering a wall which he was then able to use to guide himself towards where he knew the cabinet surely had to be. Found it, he thought to himself with a considerable sense of relief. Brandon swung the cabinet door wide and then felt around clumsily with his good hand. He hurriedly pulled out a small towel and then wrapped it around his wound. He took several deep, slow breaths to try and calm himself down, and after the passage of several minutes, checked to confirm his hand was no longer bleeding. After taking another deep, calming breath, he got himself back onto all fours and then cautiously made his way back to the crystal bowl. This time, Brandon was extremely careful when placing his hands to the floor. Upon locating one of the glass fragments, he began to feel around cautiously for the tube of glue Ilian had so generously left behind, and once located, picked up 2 crystal fragments and experimentally fitted them back together. Satisfied that he had solved the puzzle, he placed both pieces deliberately back to the floor and then picked up the tube of glue and uncapped it. He ran the mouth of the tube across the edge of each fragment before carefully squeezing them together while holding them firmly in place. He did his best to sit as still as possible while maintaining an even pressure. After what seemed like a small eternity, he very gently set the partially reconstructed bowl back down onto the floor. Feeling emotionally exhausted, Brandon slowly lay down onto his back, allowing some time to pass before attempting to glue the final piece back together. As he quietly rested, now surrounded by a haunted, ghostly silence, his thoughts instinctively wandered to the message he had sent to Alana. He reflexively sat himself back up, and then very surreptitiously fished his phone out from his pocket. He anxiously turned the device on and waited pensively for it to boot up. Very mercifully, it did not take long before he heard the magical chime of an incoming message. Checking the list of new notifications through Google's voice interface, he was utterly dismayed to learn the message was from his cellular network provider, reminding him his next bill would be due in another 5 days. Brandon stared sightlessly at the phone for a considerable length of time before reluctantly deciding to power it back down. He could not quite figure out why he did not simply call her. Trying his best to clear his mind of such neurotic musings, he forced himself back to work. He applied some glue to the partially reconstructed bowl, and then very carefully fitted the remaining fragment, waiting patiently for the final piece to set. Brandon counted backwards from 100, and then nervously placed the fully repaired bowl to the crown of his head. Holding it firmly in place, he experimentally traversed his gaze around its circumference. Although he was still able to make perfect sense of the external environment, there was now a disorientating misalignment between each eye. Very frustratingly, Brandon now found he had to concentrate extremely hard, or else the images in front of him doubled up, which in turn made it difficult for him to know exactly where things were located. Well, there was nothing else to be done. He would simply have to be extra careful when moving around, especially when going up and down the stairwell. Somewhat resignedly, he decided to take a small rest before making his way to the bedroom. He covered the crystal bowl with the towel he had used to bandage his wound, and then gently laid himself down. Without intending to do so, he quickly fell into a fitful sleep. Brandon now found himself standing in a large, dark-walled elevator, holding a hefty but compact nondescript package. He had the vaguest notion that he urgently needed to deliver it to someone important, but for some reason could not quite remember who. The elevator was currently motionless, and as his eyes panned the interior, he noticed a small silver plaque that sat affixed just above the operating console. The lettering was small to the point of illegibility, and he had to look at it very closely in order to read what it said.
Platinum Properties Incorporated is neither liable nor responsible for any injuries or fatalities that might occur to any patrons, either stupid or desperate enough to actually use this elevator. Consider yourself warned.
Feeling extremely alarmed, Brandon was just about to try and open the doors when the elevator started to rise. He looked at the large array of controls and saw there were 100 labeled floors, plus one final button at the very top of the console, which almost inconceivably was numbered 1000. With a rapidly escalating sense of panic, he randomly stabbed at the button labeled 25, but the light failed to illuminate. He then desperately tried his luck with several other floors, but suffered the exact same fate. Brandon could now do little more than watch on helplessly as the digital readout continued to count its way up at an ever-accelerating rate. It did not take long before it had roared its way past the 100th floor, and then, very thankfully, settled down to a constant velocity. The elevator eventually raced its way past the 500th floor, at which point Brandon could not help but notice the higher the elevator ascended, the smaller it seemed to become. As it neared the rooftop, it started to feel like little more than a vertical coffin. Just when he thought he was about to be crushed alive, the elevator mercifully began to slow. He was just about to breathe a sigh of relief when it lurched violently to one side before coming to a shuddering halt. The elevator doors jaggedly slid apart, and Brandon now found himself greeted to a scene of wealthy Gentiles breakfasting on a rooftop gazebo. An impeccably dressed waiter, who almost instantly caught sight of the new visitor, made a hasty and determined beeline towards him.
I hope you don't mind me saying so, sir, but you have the look of someone who is hopelessly lost. Emphasis on the word hopeless. Very regretfully then, unless by some miracle you can show me your invitation, I'm going to have to politely ask you to leave and crawl your way back into whatever filthy little hole you came out of.
The waiter had a thick Spanish accent, and Brandon noticed a small brass tag on his lapel with the name Manuel elegantly embossed upon it. He found himself staring stupidly at the waiter's face, whom he could have sworn he had seen before.
I think perhaps that might be for me,
Manuel said irritably as he snatched the package from Brandon's hand. The waiter was just about to tear the large, nondescript envelope open, but observed Brandon had not moved on.
My good sir, is there anything else I can help you with? Say perhaps a life plan, for example.
Feeling more than just a little bit flummoxed, Brandon smiled benignly and then started to wordlessly stab at the ground floor button. Nothing seemed to happen, and the elevator doors remained stubbornly open. Meanwhile, Manuel now held a small note he had fished out of the package. With a perplexed frown creasing his brow, he slowly started to read it out aloud.
To whomever it may concern, the confused-looking man standing in front of you does not belong here. In point of fact, he does not belong anywhere. Accordingly, then, please use the enclosed device to point him in the right direction.
Brandon continued to stab desperately at the button while the waiter proceeded to pull out a large handgun. Manuel took a baffled look at the man in the elevator, and then his eyes suddenly lit up like a light bulb. Just as the waiter began aiming the Walter 44 Special, Brandon caught sight of a tiny little button at the very bottom of the console. He stabbed at it desperately, and the elevator doors mercifully slid shut. 2 bullet holes appeared in the door, just narrowly missing Brandon's head. The lift began its painfully slow descent, and the walls gradually began to widen back up. After what seemed like a small eternity, the doors slid open at the 100th floor. A large, unruly crowd instantly swarmed their way in. Just beyond the surging throng, Brandon was able to make out a medical gurney, with a large cluster of masked surgeons gathered all around it. As Brandon struggled to get a view of the patient, he could not help but notice the chaotic group of passengers were comprised primarily of a large gaggle of misbehaving children, with a very harassed but friendly-looking woman doing her level best to herd them into the elevator. Following closely behind her was a heavy-set man in an expensive-looking suit, holding a newspaper under one arm, and who was seemingly completely oblivious of the bedlam going on all around him.
I'm not trying to say that we can't save him.
Brandon heard one of the surgeons proclaim wearily, just as the doors began to close.
But surely you cannot help but have noticed that sniveling coward hiding at the back of the elevator. How can we possibly justify so much time and effort on such a demonstrably hopeless case?
The man in the expensive suit, apparently entirely disinterested in the surgeon's conversation, jabbed nonchalantly at the ground floor button. The lift instantly went into free fall, and the floor literally disappeared from underneath everyone's feet. The children began to scream hysterically, and Brandon felt his stomach leap up into his mouth. The elevator seemed to plummet forever, allowing Brandon ample time to contemplate their explosive demise. However, the lift's floor lightly came back to meet their feet, and it continued to progressively decelerate. By the time it came to a stop, everyone in the elevator was now behaving as if nothing even remotely unusual had transpired. When the doors smoothly slid wide, the suited man went in one direction, and the lady with the gaggle of children went in the other. Brandon observed that they appeared to be in a large and complex maze of hedges. He was instantly filled with debilitating anxiety as to who he should choose to follow. The problem was, if he didn't make a very quick decision, he would soon be left completely alone, and without the slightest clue of how to escape the impenetrable puzzle now laid out before him. He briefly considered retreating back into the elevator, but to his utter dismay discovered nothing but an endless and incomprehensible maze now lay behind him. Even worse, he had apparently waited for too long, and there was no one left to follow. It seemed that he was now very much alone, and from this moment on, surely always would be.
Well, this fucking sucks.
Brandon muttered miserably to himself. After a few more moments of tortured indecision, he decided to set off after the suited man. But several hours later, he resigned himself to the fact he was hopelessly lost. Brandon could no longer escape the feeling he would probably die of thirst and starvation in this seemingly endless maze to nowhere. A feeling of hopeless despair welled up from deep within him, but in his moment of utter defeat, he suddenly noticed what appeared to be an old and yellowed newspaper lying on the ground next to his foot. Picking the paper up, his eyes were instantly drawn to one of the headlines which sat directly above a large photo of the very same man he had been pursuing from the elevator. The headline read,
"Billionaire property developer, still missing after 7 weeks."
Now, as intrigued as he was perplexed, Brandon began to read the associated article.
Divisive celebrity property tycoon and presidential hopeful, Damian Trunk, is still missing in action after nearly 2 months. He was last seen leaving Trunk Towers by an orphanage volunteer who was on a field trip with a group of children to take up Trunk's highly publicized free but still extremely experimental vaccination offer for the homeless, Ivana Mektin. Maria Vasquez, 33, originally from Portland, Oregon, by way of Tijuana, Mexico, said she saw him while traveling together in an elevator, but as far as she could tell, he did not appear to be in any sort of distress or difficulty. It has since been alleged by Trunk's many detractors that the property tycoon had not in fact taken the Trunk Laboratories developed vaccine himself. The presidential hopeful has, however, vehemently denied the accusation, calling it nothing but fake news. In apparent retaliation, Trunk has since been very vocal in calling for his supporters to stop wearing masks in public, a punitive gesture tantamount to cutting off one's nose to spite their face. Up until the time of his disappearance, he had steadfastly declined to produce a vaccination certificate, in order to put the issue to rest, stating that to do so would be a clear violation of his constitutional rights. At time of publication, there have been no new developments as to his whereabouts, but perhaps very crucially, Vasquez also claimed there was another passenger who shared the lift with them. She described him as a nondescript, middle-aged man of slim build and sightless eyes. When pressed for further details on pain of deportation, Miss Vasquez reluctantly added that he looked like the quintessential lost soul, desperately trying to find out where he belonged. She said that she would not be at all surprised if he was still somewhere on that elevator, endlessly going from floor to floor in the vain hope he might yet be revealed unto himself before his journey finally came to a tragic end. The orphanage volunteer also stated that while she didn't exactly fancy his chances, she still prayed that his eternal soul might one day find peace. To date, all requests for this man to come forward have failed miserably. With every elevator having 1,000 floors and every floor having 1,000 elevators, the local police are now complaining that they simply lack both the budget and resources to search each and every location. Nonetheless, authorities have confirmed he is a person of interest and should be treated as extremely dangerous until proven otherwise. The public are advised not to approach him, but if they do, then they should adopt a shoot first and ask questions later mentality.
Feeling deeply alarmed, Brandon scanned the page and quickly found another related article.
Damian Trunk's presidential bid had been doing extremely well in the latest opinion polls just prior to his very suspicious disappearance. This fact was largely attributed to his explosively popular campaign pledge to lay hundreds of thousands of landmines across the entire U.S.-Mexico border. When asked how he would fund the project and who would be responsible for laying the mines, Trunk replied that he was currently in negotiations with Hezbollah, who had amply demonstrated the necessary expertise and, perhaps much more importantly, were offering their services at a highly discounted rate via the H-1B visa lottery program. Footnote: Damian Trunk's latest mail-order bride, Russian beauty queen Svetlana Trunk, is embroiled in a multi-million-dollar class-action lawsuit in relation to her exclusive cosmetic line, Eternal Beatific. She is accused of selling an over-the-internet anti-aging drug that has allegedly caused many women to develop webbed feet and who now stands to inherit her husband's entire financial empire should he fail to show up for next year's Thanksgiving turkey. Svetlana, 50 years her husband's junior, is quoted as saying she would love nothing more than to be America's next First Lady, but has been otherwise strangely silent regarding his mysterious disappearance.
Brandon reread the article several times with a growing sense of incredulity. It simply didn't make sense. Was this really the same paper Damian had been carrying under his arm and missing for 2 months? After all, it had only been several hours since they all left the lift. Worse still, shoot first? Who knows? Perhaps Trunk was actually right. Surely this had to be nothing but fake news, just part of some sort of elaborate and demented joke. He began to feel as if the universe was conspiring against him, and threw the newspaper away in utter disgust. It was now starting to get dark, so Brandon decided that he had little other choice than to keep walking. If only he had followed the friendly lady, maybe none of this would have happened. Why, oh why did he always seem to make the wrong choices? Some several hours later, as he continued to meander through the maze aimlessly, his worst fears were finally realized when he came across a completely decomposed body. Although it was now nothing but a skeleton in a suit, the hair on its skull was still in almost perfect, pristine condition. He carefully knelt down next to the body's head and gently rubbed the hair between two of his fingers. Synthetic, just as he had long suspected. Very clearly, this man, assumedly Damien Trunk, had been dead for a very long time. Again, none of this made even the remotest kind of sense. It was only then that Brandon realized he was sporting a long gray beard and that his hands were covered in liver spots. Feeling all hope drain from his soul, he looked despairingly up into the sky, which was now pitch black and completely devoid of stars.
Please, for the love of God, just stop. Haven't I suffered enough?
Brandon weepingly begged of some unseen and unknowable God, just as a sharp, stabbing pain violently crashed into the side of his ribs.
Oh, wake up, Mr. Forsyth. I really can't abide someone who talks in their sleep. After all, what happens in the dream world should stay in the dream world.
Brandon sat himself up stiffly and angrily pulled the towel away from the crystal bowl. He was just about to pick the bowl up, but was easily beaten to it by the tall, shadowy man.
Aha, I see you've been very busy while I've been away.
Ilian began to examine the remade bowl very closely, and Brandon watched his sharp green eyes scouring its crystal lattice with a considerable sense of apprehension. Seemingly satisfied, the skeletal man placed it down onto the hardwood table with an alarmingly hefty thunk.
Not bad, Mr. Forsyth. Not bad at all. But just to be sure, let's check your workmanship a little more closely, shall we?
The cruel-looking man placed his suitcase down next to the bowl before flipping the lid open. He pulled out a large water-filled Ziploc bag that appeared to have a small goldfish aimlessly swimming around within it. He swiftly unzipped the plastic bag and then poured the contents haphazardly into the crystal bowl.
Well, all right then. What say we check for leaks? Always better to be safe than sorry, as they so often like to say.
Ilian lifted the bowl up from the table and perched it precariously on the fingertips of one hand. He then smoothly raised it up above his head and tilted his face up searchingly.
So far, so good.
The cruel man said dispassionately, with his gaze firmly fixed to the base of the crystal bowl. Ilian remained perfectly still as he patiently waited to see if the bowl would start to leak. Brandon caught himself holding his breath.
Well, what else can I really say, except exceptional work, Mr. Forsyth?
The tall man announced rather unenthusiastically, sounding almost disappointed. However, no sooner had Ilian finished speaking than a large drop of water formed at the bottom of the bowl and then splashed down directly onto his forehead.
Oh, Mr. Forsyth, this is deeply disappointing, to say the very least. Then again, perhaps my expectations were just a little bit unrealistic, given your abysmal track record. Not to worry, though. I'll give you one more shot. After all, everyone deserves a second chance, even a hopeless wretch like you.
The tall man's eyes flashed violent red as he took the bowl in both hands and then lifted it up high above his head.
This is what we like to call in the trade character building.
Ilian thrust the bowl straight down towards the floor with maximum destructive force. Shards of crystal exploded into the air as Brandon cried out in despairing anguish.
Now, Mr. Forsyth, try to have some dignity.
The shadowy man dipped into one of his pockets and then casually tossed a small tube onto the floor.
Well. It seems very much as if we are both now about to find out what you are really made of.
The skeletal man stood like a predator hiding in the shadows as he watched the stranded goldfish flap its tail helplessly in the air. After a short moment of terrifying silence, Brandon suddenly felt the moist heat of Ilian's breath on his face, which had the distinct smell of raw fish.
This is your moment to shine, Mr. Forsyth, so I beseech you, don't let me down. By the way, upon further reflection, I am somewhat inclined to agree with your own personal assessment. You really are a worthless piece of shit, so I defy you to try and prove us both wrong.
To Brandon's profound relief, Ilian's putrid breath began to waft away. Moments later, he heard the distinct sound of someone vomiting, followed quickly by the toilet flushing. The tall man called out gleefully as he began to descend the stairwell.
Time to get to work, Mr. Forsyth. You know what they say about idle hands. No, I fear you have a very long night ahead of you if you have any designs on finishing the job before my return. And let's face it, the last thing either of us wants is another dead goldfish.
Brandon heard the door slam shut as he sat all alone in the darkness. When Ilian returned the following morning, Brandon appeared not to have moved at all. He was sitting peacefully on his heels, his hands closed into fists while resting comfortably upon his lap. All around him lay the shattered remains of the crystal bowl.
Oh, Mr. Forsyth, how profoundly disappointing. It appears my worst fears have been realized, and you have very much lived down to my expectations.
Ilian surveyed the myriad of tiny broken crystal fragments lying scattered all over the floor, and then shook his head sadly.
Well, I suppose I should clean this mess up then.
Brandon heard Ilian's suitcase flick open, followed quickly by the sound of someone using a brush and saucepan to sweep the floor all around him.
Much better,
the hollow man announced emphatically, before taking an appraising look at the desolate figure still sitting on the floor.
Oh, come now, Mr. Forsyth. Might I suggest you simply learn to suffer in silence, while doing your best to get on with what small fragments of your pathetic life still remain. You are, of course, more than welcome to wallow in your own self-pity, if you truly believe that doing so is what will serve you best. I wouldn't recommend it, though. After all, what is done, and those that do not learn from their mistakes are surely doomed to repeat them. I'm pretty sure that I read that somewhere on the back of a cereal box, so you just know it has to be true.
Brandon remained disconcertingly silent and appeared to be in an almost trance-like state. Seemingly out of the blue, the soft chime of a smartphone notification violently shattered its way through the glass-like silence.
I think that might be for me,
Ilian proclaimed emphatically, as he swiftly snatched the smartphone off the floor. The tall man peered inquisitively into the face of the device and then raised an eyebrow as he turned a sympathetic gaze towards the seated figure kneeling silently in front of him.
Let me try to put it this way, Mr. Forsyth. Just because she can't love you doesn't mean she doesn't love you. Now, I know that may sound completely nonsensical, but if you read carefully between the lines, you will come to understand it all makes perfect sense. No, but seriously, the most precious things, if you try to hold on to them too tightly, will always break, every single time.
Ilian casually tossed the phone into Brandon's lap.
Now please don't worry yourself. I took the liberty of deleting the message in order to spare you from any further unnecessary suffering. No need to thank me. Just consider it a gentle kindness. By the way, in answer to your earlier question, I'd love a cup of tea. Milk, no sugar, if that's not too much trouble to ask.
Brandon's sightless eyes remained closed, but some tears started to slowly roll down his cheeks.
Fuck you, Ilian. Fuck you and the horse that you rode in on.
The tall, thin man laughed incredulously.
Not that I have anything against horses, but as it turns out, I came here on the back of a dragon. Look, Mr. Forsyth, perhaps I should show you something. I genuinely think it may help.
Ilian now stood within Brandon's mind's eye. With a wave of his hand, they were both magically transported to an ancient medieval town, surrounded by throngs of terrified people running around in mindless panic. A huge blue and white dragon swooped majestically through the air. The ancient town shops and buildings were ablaze, and countless people lay dead and wounded throughout the many streets and alleys. The huge dragon swooped low as it came in for its final run, this time targeting the busy town square where both Ilian and Brandon were now standing. A small, hysterical child hugged herself desperately to Brandon's leg, as if it would somehow protect her from the coming flames. The entire square became engulfed in red, and the deafening screams quickly subsided. As the mass of frenzied bodies turned into formless ash, Ilian pointed to the retreating dragon, which was already disappearing into the horizon.
That, Mr. Forsyth, you cannot control even on your strongest day.
With a dramatic flourish, he then drew forth a glittering sword and held it up high into the air.
Now then, Mr. Forsyth, are you seriously trying to contend you can actually defeat dragons with this? Well, if so, then I think you have read one too many fairy tales.
The tall, thin man, who was now dressed in a dark hooded robe, resheathed the sword and then turned a finger upon himself.
But this, on the other hand, you can control. Now, no one ever said it would be easy. Mastery of oneself seldom is. But I assure you, Mr. Forsyth, it is entirely achievable for those brave few with the wisdom and fortitude to explore their own truth, no matter how ugly and shameful it may seem to their own eyes. In other words, Mr. Forsyth, own your own shit. Be thankful you weren't that little girl, and grow the fuck up.
The scene of utter devastation slowly faded out as Brandon looked down at the small, charred skeleton that still clung haplessly to his leg. He now found himself all alone again within the darkness and solitude that continued to imprison his mind.
Well, for better or worse, it seems that my job here is done. I'm going to leave you now in peace, Mr. Forsyth, this time for good.
The tall, thin man now held a thick plastic bag containing the broken fragments of the crystal bowl. He bounced it up and down casually in his hand and was just about to place it into his suitcase when a perplexed frown spread across his face. After a brief moment of indecision, Ilian simply shrugged his shoulders, dropped the bag into his case, and then latched it shut with a satisfying click of finality. Right at that very moment, a radiant beam streaked its way across the dining room floor, shrouding Brandon in glorious sunlight.
Say it ain't so.
Ilian exclaimed loudly, genuine shock resonating in his voice.
Surely that can't be a rainbow peeking its way through your window.
The tall man strode briskly towards the curtains and pulled them apart defiantly. Dust went wafting up into the air as if they had not been opened for many years.
Well, there's no doubt about it, Mr. Forsyth. The sun really has come out to play. You see, it's just like I said. There are some things we simply cannot control, apparently. Not even me.
Ilian turned his gaze to the candle. Its flame seemed very small and insignificant now that it was bathed in the glorious morning sunlight.
Well, I don't suppose you will be needing this anymore,
the tall man said very matter-of-factly as he gently blew out the small dancing flame. With a slow, resigned sigh, he then slipped the candle into one of his pockets, picked up his suitcase, and turned to leave. Brandon again felt Ilian's breath on his face, but this time it smelt like fresh alpine air.
I know what you did, Mr. Forsyth, but your secret is safe with me. After all, it's more than just a little bit gratifying to see that you finally understand the difference between fate and destiny. Who knows? I might even consider changing my middle name.
He heard Ilian's muffled footsteps making their way down the stairwell before the door slammed shut for one last time. Only then did he allow his sightless eyes to open. In each hand, he held a small and carefully crafted ball of crystal. It had taken him most of the night to glue the fragments together into the shape and size of an eyeball, but now that Ilian was finally gone for good, he surreptitiously proceeded to place each ball into his empty sockets. Although it made him feel very afraid, he knew it was finally time to try and use his newly constructed eyes to count all the dead bodies left behind. Just as he had feared, the world looked very different now. indistinct, phased out, and blotchy. But he could still see well enough to see that Ilian was absolutely right. The sun was out, and it was a truly beautiful day. Brandon let out a ragged sigh just as his smartphone quietly chimed. The message read, "I am so sorry I wasn't there for you when you needed me, but my daughter has fallen very, very ill. Please let me know you are okay. Love, Alana." Brandon wordlessly powered the smartphone down. No, he wasn't okay. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like just maybe he would be. He slowly stood himself up, grabbed his guitar and a cushion, and then seated himself back down in the brilliant morning sunlight. Truly, I hope she is going to be okay. He whispered to himself quietly, and then began to play.